So good evening. I'm David Roxburgh, Chair of the Department of History of Art and Architecture, and Prince Al-Wali ibn Talal, Professor of Islamic Art History at Harvard University. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I wanted to go over some of the details of our Zoom webinar this evening. Following my introduction and our speaker's lecture, we'll take questions through the Q&A box, which is at the lower right of the Zoom webinar window, or you may raise your hand and I will call upon you to ask your question directly to the speaker. We aim to conclude the event by about 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I wanted to thank Professor Gulru Najibalu for convening the series this year, and Cecily Pollard for organizing the speakers, and of course, so much more. We're very grateful to Cecily for all the work that she does in the department and in the program. And also wanted to thank Marcus Mayo and J.M. Gomez for technical assistance throughout the lecture series. So Kishwar Rizvi, our speaker this evening, is Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at Yale University, and has joined us this year as an Aga Khan Fellow. Her recent publications include The Transnational Mosque, Architecture and Historical Memory in the Contemporary Middle East, published by University of North Carolina Press in 2015, for which she was selected as a Carnegie Foundation Scholar, and also Emotion and Subjectivity in Early Modern Muslim Empires, New Studies in Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal Art and Culture, for which she served as editor. It was published by Brill in 2017. Her earlier publications include The Safavid Dynastic Shrine, History, Religion, and Architecture in Early Modern Iran, published by the British Institute of Persian Studies and IB Tauris in 2011, and the anthology, Modernism and the Middle East, Architecture and Politics in the 20th Century, University of Washington Press, 2008, which was awarded a Graham Foundation publication grant. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with Professor Rizvi's scholarship, there are many, many important articles that could be added to this list. The title of her lecture this evening, the last in our Aga Khan lecture series for the academic year 21-22, is Documentary Lives, Sketch as Chronicle in Shah Abbasi's Iran. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rizvi to tonight's series.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David and Guru, for the invitation to speak here, but more importantly, for allowing me to be a fellow. It's very nice to be back in Cambridge, but more importantly, it's really wonderful to have this time and your company while I'm here. So thank you. And before I start, I'd also like to thank a number of colleagues actually, but I won't make that long list. But in particular, Dr. Olga Vasilyeva at the Russian National Library, who has been incredibly helpful despite what's going on in her part of the world, sadly, and the way it's affecting the library and its functions. And like her, other colleagues who have really, we haven't been able to travel and get around very much. So it is the generosity of friends and colleagues that really matters. And to that, I'll add Sunil Sharma, Emine Fetzbachi, and Simon Vetig, and Masume Farhad for conversations about this project. Of course, all misinterpretations and wrong translations are mine. So we will go on with that. Now, to make sure. Okay, here we go. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes. I hope if I'm going too slow, please tell me to speed up and I will. But there's a lot of material and I hope that we can get through it all. Prominent among the cultural products of Shah Abbas's reign are the diverse historical chronicles dedicated to him and the extensive architectural and engineering projects he commissioned throughout the Safavid Empire. in addition to establishing the magnificent city of Isfahan as a world capital through a dynamic reconfiguration of its architectural and urban design, the Shah envisioned Iran as a destination for merchants and ambassadors from the far reaches of Europe and Asia. But this landscape of cultural exchange was, of course, foregrounded by intense European colonial and military activity across the globe, from the Americas to Southeast Asia. And I've spoken a little bit about that the last time I was here a year ago. We may ask, how did early modern subjects, be they rulers, artists, or diplomats, imagine their place within an interconnected economy of exchange, one in which artworks existed alongside and perhaps even enabled by changing conceptions of selfhood? Today's talk focuses on art and history making in the Safavid court, with a focus on the artist Riza Abbasi. As many of you know, he is well known not only for his beautiful paintings, but for his sketches of pilgrims and courtiers, lovers and warriors, capturing quotidian moments in vivid detail. His drawings may be viewed as a lens into the life worlds of Safavid Iran, which were intrinsically diverse and yet interconnected. And I should also gesture to other colleagues who've worked on this material, most notably Catherine Babayan, who I think is maybe here. So this work really builds and adds, I hope, is a humble addition. I want to begin by connecting Reza's work to an older tradition of Persian painting, that of historical narration. Both the illustrated chronicles and the single sheet drawings that I'm going to discuss primarily are connected in their concern with representing time, whether it's historical events or chance encounters. Illustrating history has, of course, a long tradition in Persian art, and most relevant for this essay are earlier Timurid manuscripts, and you can think of the Zafarname of Yazdi or the Majma' Tawarikh of Hafiz Abru. For the 16th and 17th centuries, one may look to Safavid contemporaries such as the Ottomans and the Mughals, and my colleagues, Gulru Nejipoglu, Emine Fatwachi, Abakokh, and others have written extensively about them. But less work has been done in the case of the Safavids, with a few notable exceptions. Narrative illustration at the turn of the 17th century hew closely to chronicles written by imperial chroniclers. Thus, for example, we may see an enthronement scene, such as what is here on your screen, in a manuscript of the Khulasat of Tawarikh of Qazi Ahmad Qomi at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. The text was completed in 1599, ending with Shah Abbas's recapture of Khurasan, but the paintings were likely done some years later. While the date and the provenance may not be secure, the intention of the illustrated program is. The image that you see here shows the enthronement of the young Shah Abbas. Right here is this young figure sitting in the Chehel Sutun palace in Qazvin, and this event took place in 1588. The young prince was just 17 years old at the time, a hairless youth, as they would say in the language of the period, and seated himself on the blessed throne in the Iwan, or the portal of the Chehel Sutun, and you can see this in the text right above, Dar Iwan-e Chehel Sutun. A poem follows, which is this below right here, evoking God in this most excellent edifice, an exhilarating blessed palace whose doors and walls are adorned with pictures and decoration, tasvir, the tazeen, right here. The scene surpassing the renowned portrait galleries of China, the Surat Khane Chin, and here, of course, the references to Mani, the mythical painter. This unsurpassed beauty of the palace is second only to the glory of the gathering, the ascension of the young prince surrounded by his faithful. We don't have any attribution for this painting, but we do have a hint in the Tarikh-e-Alam Araye Abbasi, a history written by the court historian Iskandar Beg Munshi. In a section on famous artists, he tells us about Maulana Muzaffar Ali, a painter active during the reign of Shah Abbas, who, quote, and this is the Savory translation, became a master of both line and form, The paintings of the royal palace and of a royal assembly in the Chehel Sutun Hall were drawn by him. And most of the painting was also his work, unquote. We can't be sure that Muzaffar Ali painted this particular image, but we can glean that the painting, like the event, is not entirely fictional, and that the artist had, at the very least, knowledge of the Chehel Sutun and could recreate, if not an exact likeness, then an idealization of reality. So these talars that we see here, the portico, these are based on certain architectural remnants that even exist up until now. What I'd like you to take away is that this is a reflection of a known place and a distinct historical event. Let's focus on another such event, which held great importance for the Safavid state and was documented by all of Shah Abbas's historians, namely his recapture of Khurasan. And this is the heart, in some sense, of this talk. And this is from 1598. It was the subject of the Futuhat-e-Humayun, which you see here by Siaq-i-Nizam. And this copy that you see is from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It had been 9 long years since the Uzbek armies had seized the holy city of Mashhad, home of the shrine of Ali Raza, the 8th Shia Imam. The site held special significance to Shah Abbas, who presented himself as a devout and pious leader, and its loss was felt deeply. After stabilizing his western borders, the Shah turned his attention towards Khurasan, the northeastern province where the shrine is located. The manuscript is undated, however, it contains 4 miniatures that are believed to be from around 1600 or 1605, likely of Shirazi origin. In her essay on the arts commissioned by the Ghulams or the Shahs, slaves of the Shah, Masume Farhad suggests that it was most likely commissioned by, or perhaps for, Shah Abbas's trusted general, Alaverdi Khan. This hypothesis is supported by, excuse me, by the frontispiece, which opens with a hunting scene on the right, where lions and wild boar are being killed, surrounded also by other animals such as cheetahs, bears, and deer. On the left, the Shah is seen riding his horse, accompanied by his musicians. Down here, I'm sorry, it's a pretty badly damaged image, set of images, and courtiers. And yet it's familiar. We see the ruler right here with his parasol right above. So it's an image that is one that we have come to associate with the iconography of kingship. In fact, both Siaq-i-Nizam and Munshi begin the account of the Khurasan campaign with the Shah's march from Isfahan and his travel to Mazandaran, where the Shah stopped in the royal hunting ground near Firozkoh, telling us, in fact, Siaq-i-Nizam tells us that in fact he went there for a lion hunt. The royal hunt was a public ceremonial meant to showcase imperial attributes such as valor, skill, and generosity, as Amit Sadan has written in his study of Safavid imperial legitimacy and its relationship to the natural world and the Tarikh al-Alamara Abbasi. For example, Munshi tells us a story about a hunt that took place on the plains of Radakhan after the Safavid rulers successfully had regained Herat. As was the custom, beaters were sent to drive the game, and Shah Abbas spent much of the day hunting gazelle. At the end of the hunt, some 2,000 or 3,000 gazelle were still within the circle when something quite remarkable happened, and I'll quote again from Munshi. Some instinct guided the animals towards the place where the Shah was standing, and after circling around him several times, like pilgrims circumambulating the Kaaba, they all sought refuge near him and lay down around him, giving the Shah the appearance of a shepherd watching over his flock. When he saw this, the Shah gave orders that the animals should not be molested any further. So there's a lot you can take away from this idea of the control of nature, the generosity, the benevolence of the Shah. This drawing from the National Museum of Asian Art, the Freer collection in DC, illustrates the drama once such a hunt had commenced. The animals have been driven towards the center, and you can see this because the horses are surrounding them, the hunters. And we see an array such as wild boar, deer, lions, and leopards. The hunters are using bows and arrows as well as swords. The detailed brushwork is masterful, as are the multiple gestures and poses of the men as well as their prey. The artists are not drawing just idealized images. Rather, they are built on close observation. And I'm not suggesting that this image was made on site, but rather that they would have known. And these sorts of images of this ibex that has been overturned or the braying wild boar are built on certain ways of looking. Interspersed between military campaigns or other momentous occasions, the royal hunting grounds became stages for the enactment of kingship, a trope that fit well with the Safavids' keen attention to pre-Islamic tropes, such as those told in the Shahnameh, for example, or think of the iconography of the Achaemenids in Persepolis. One of the best observers of his world was Riza Abbasi, and this drawing from 1035, 1626 could be at first glance similarly documentary, but it isn't. Not only are the very stylized images added almost like mini vignettes pasted onto the composition, but the text which sits in the center also gives something else away. And it reads, "In the name of God, the first day of the month of the auspicious Shawwal in the year 1035. This drawing was colored in the work of the humble Riza Abbasi." We know that Shah Abbas was returning at this time from his Baghdad campaign in the summer of 1626, and that he spent it near Hamadan at the royal hunting grounds. But if we think a little more closely, and we look a little bit more closely at the date, it's the 1st of Shawwal, which is Eid, which is this is the beginning, right to the end of Ramadan, and the day that is not an obvious one to go hunting. Yes, the men have, and here we get a closer look, the men have started the ducks or the geese, which fly noisily away, and you can see them sort of fluttering across. But there are no weapons in their hands. Rather, there's a certain quietness around the image. Look at this man on the cheetah on the horse. His cheetah is actually looking the other way. There's a horse up here who's nibbling at grass at his feet. This is not an observed image, but a kind of presentation image. And we can talk about this distinction in a moment. Let's return for a moment to the Mashhad campaign. While Siyahi Nizam and Munshi fleetingly tell us that the Shah stopped in Mazandaran, the court astrologer Jalaluddin Yazdi, or Munajjim, gives us more detail. In a long entry on the Uzbek campaign, which he calls the Eid-e-Khurasani, Yazdi describes the 15 days that Shah Abbas and his entourage spent in Firuzkoh, which I will paraphrase. He writes that during these days of pleasure and rest, the Shah was joined by the older Sadiqi Bey Kitabdar, who we know had assumed this position just about this time, the great Mullah Mir Ali and Mullah Ali Raza, who had compiled an album, a Kitab-e-Khirqe, which contained in it calligraphy, khatut, by great masters, comprising drawings by great artists, painters, gilders, and binders, and their dates were established. This passage is important for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that we have an event that has been witnessed by the court historian, and who is with them? Sadiqi Bey, Mir Ali, Ali Raza, the famed calligrapher. But more importantly, let's think about first the context of the making and the presentation of the Muraqqah, and how we may consider the art of the book in the context of other imperial rituals, such as hunting and recreation. Second, let's consider the Shah's entourage, or sources, if you will. Not only what happens, but who is there to record it. That is to say, who is telling the story? What are their media, texts, and images? And what might we learn from both about how history was documented and also what the artist or the author's role might be in its construction. Third, where did the manuscript go? Were they deposited in the imperial treasury soon after this meeting, which at this time would have been in the Saadat Palace in Qazvin, perhaps even the Chehel Sutun that we just saw. Lastly, what are the implications for the artist, for the objects or the images, calligraphy, paintings that were collected therein? So in these few minutes that we have together, I'm not going to be able to go in depth into all of these issues, of course, but I do want to bring them up for us to think about. But let's begin with the Muraqqa, which again, several colleagues here, David Roxburgh among them foremost, have written extensively on. And so what I'm going to present is a very humble, specific contribution to that conversation. From Yazdi, we learned that the Shah's entourage included artists such as Sadiqi Beg, the head of the Royal Library, as well as Ali Raza, as I've mentioned. The latter had also compiled this album of painting and calligraphy. The compilation of the album is in itself not as remarkable as its presentation, which took place not at a shrine or a palace, but in the intimacy of a royal hunt. And again, colleagues working in the Ottoman context, such as Tule Artan and others, have also spoken about this sort of externalization of these types of rituals. That Yazdi, among Shah Abbas's closest courtiers and companions, was witness to the presentation speaks to a little examined aspect of Shah Abbas's patronage. Although a great deal of attention has been paid, rightfully, to Shah Abbas's architectural works and to the remarkable output of his court historians and chroniclers, and despite the fact that we know that he had favorite artists and calligraphers, much work remains to be done on Shah Abbas's relationship to the visual arts. We know from Munshi that Shah Abbas had a vast collection of illustrated manuscripts and ancient Qur'ans, along with the precious objects such as gems, silvers, and porcelains, which were donated to the shrine of Sheikh Safi in Ardabil, as well as to that of Imam Raza in Mashhad. A useful resource for the collection in Ardabil, for example, is the Ganjine Sheikh Safi, which is an 18th century inventory of objects in the Safavid dynastic shrine, which was compiled by the custodian in the 18th century. The Ganjina lists everything from the gold finial above the tomb of Shah Ismail's tomb to porcelain and religious texts in the hand of Imam Ali. Books were divided by type, starting with the Qur'ans and Hadiths, poetic anthologies, and historical chronicles, such as we've been discussing. There's a short entry under Muraqqa, in which the author has listed 4 books, giving detailed descriptions of their bindings, the type of paper, how many pages there are, etc. In one entry, we're told that the Muraqqa comprises of gilded and colorful opening pages with paintings in gold, with double titled pages. So the details, but not that much about the inside of these albums. Now, these 4 albums also show up again in the catalogue of Oriental prints and manuscripts of the Bibliothèque Impériale Publique de St. Petersburg, the Library of St. Petersburg of 1852. The heart of this catalogue are the Persian manuscripts that comprise the so-called Dorn collection. As many here know, in the Russo-Iranian War of 1826 and 27, Ardabil was occupied by Russian forces, including the shrine of Sheikh Safi. The bulk of the manuscript collection was removed to St. Petersburg in 1828, where it is now at the Russian National Library. The Ardabil shrine collection, and perhaps that's a more accurate term for it, are distinguished by the Waqf dedications on the opening pages of the manuscripts. The majority are dedicated by Shah Abbas I, but there are also a few that are dedicated by Abbas II. And here I really, again, have to reiterate my thanks and gratitude for Dr. Vassilieva for helping me get these high-quality images, again, at a time of great difficulty. As you can see, they have seals that are not very clear to read, and yet we can start to do that, and we'll do it together. And notations at the bottoms too. The text here reads roughly the Kalb-e Astane Ali of Hazrat Ali, peace be upon him, Abbas al-Safavi, endowed this book to the blessed shrine of Sheikh Safi, may God's benevolence be upon him. For whoever comes here may read it with the stipulation that it may not be taken out of the shrine. Whoever removes it is cursed as a participant in the death of Hazrat Imam Hussain, may peace be upon him. As I mentioned, when she talks about the pious donation made in 1608 by Shah Abbas, and 200 years after that pious donation, these books are removed and land up in St. Petersburg. And there's much to say, of course, about this very powerful evocation and the pathos that it evokes as these books languish now in St. Petersburg, where very few people have the pleasure to view or read them. Colleagues present here have, of course, done important work on the dispersal of manuscripts, so I need not mention the dismemberment that many have undergone and the very great difficulty of recreating what they might have once been. And in that case, we can be somewhat grateful that they remain somewhat intact in St. Petersburg. The case of Dorn 148, as it's known, which is dated 1022, is worth noting, in which the book is specifically called a murakka. And here you can see that. So it's very specific to this particular object. With calligraphy attributed, and this is an extremely interesting object in itself. The seal has been damaged, but you can sort of make out here the 1 and the 8. So I'd like to think perhaps that it is 1007, excuse me, 7, not 8, and 1007, which would correspond beautifully with 1599 and Yazdi's description of a murakka presentation. But the seal requires closer consideration. We know that several albums had entered the royal atelier early in Shah Abbas's reign. And this is just another image from this book. As seen by the seal of Shah Abbas, dated 995, in this drawing by Mohammedian, here's the seal. And here's another one that is more damaged, but looks almost exactly the same, with a drawing by Riza Abbasi, which is, and both of these actually are in Washington, D.C. In the discussion to follow, I want to focus primarily on one artist, as I promised, on Riza Abbasi, Shah Abbas's favorite, hence the takhallus that he has. The son of a court artist, Ali Asghar, would have been in the Mughal court known as a Khanezad, since he was born in the imperial atelier. And both Qazi Ahmad Qummi and Iskandar Beg Munshi describe him in great detail. And it's important to mention here that there's the catalog compiled by Sheila Canby in 1996 remains an extremely important source for Riza Abbasi's work. Qazi Ahmad Qummi, in an often quoted passage in the 1606 Gulistan-e-Hunar, calls Riza the so-called painter of beauty, who in the flower of his youth brought the elegance of his brushwork to portraiture and likeness. And here he calls it tasveer wa chehre gushai. So this idea of the chehra, the face, the literal aspect of drawing the face is very clearly pointed out and remarked on. To the degree that if Mani and Behzad were living today, they would praise his hand and brush 1,000 times a day and so on. So he gives him a lot of praise. But then Qummi adds that Agha Riza is now in the most honorable service of the Shah, may God make his reign eternal. But the vicissitudes of fate have totally altered his nature. The company of wretched and free-spirited people are spoiling his disposition. That is today what he calls these people who are now Murad and Laband. And he's addicted to watching wrestling and to acquire competence and instruction in this profession. So basically, he has become himself a lowlife. And there's a lot more to be said about that. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. But it's fascinating, again, to compare him with other artists of this time. Sadiqi Beg is also described as being foul-tempered, but not Ghiyas, the weaver, about whom we have several authors writing, such as in the Majma' Khawas, and so on. So there is a distinction being made between artists. Iskander Boeg Munshi primarily reiterates the same thing as Qomi, so I'm not going to repeat it here. So what do we take away? First, that Reza was a favorite artist of Shah Abbas, who held him in high regard, that he was skillful and talented, with a particular ability when it came to drawing likenesses. We also learned that he was independent-minded and to some extent antisocial, choosing the company of wrestlers and other figures marginalized by the elite. And clearly, his peers don't agree don't think very highly of him. And in many ways, considering his output and how much we know through his works, he remains quite an enigma for us, at least in the textual sources. But let's look at those works that he leaves us. Reza's Youth and Old Man, which is a drawing also at the National Museum of Asian Art, is of particular interest. Not only is there a seal on it, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner, which appears to be quite early, again, perhaps 995, 999. The lyricism and finesse of the drawing is difficult to fully appreciate in this true dimensional format I'm afraid that you're looking at. So imagine this gold outlines and how they would reflect if you're sitting or standing in front of them, which they indeed do. The bodies of the two men have been painted in this gold wash. You can see them here. With pops of blue accentuated with their sashes. Each hair of the fur-lined coat right here of the young man has been painstakingly drawn. The description fits nicely with what we find the Ganjina of drawing in gold in some sense. The early dating of the drawing is also borne out by the signature, in which the artist refers to himself simply as Agha Reza. He hasn't added the Takhallus of Abbasi yet. I'd like to draw your attention to another word here, mashq, which we usually understand as an exercise or practice, and is a term more often used in calligraphic exercises than in paintings. Now, scholars have commented extensively on the many modalities for understanding the calligraphic arts in the early modern period, including David Roxburgh in his seminal article on the sensual and sensuous in Islamic calligraphy. Among his many insights, David compellingly argues for moving away from assuming calligraphy as mechanical copying towards viewing it as embodied practice, in which the trace of the writer predicates upon social and philosophical expectations. The topic of mashq was famously transcribed in the 16th century Safavid treatise, the Adab-e-Mashq, or the Manual of Penmanship, a short essay on writing the Nastaliq hand. Karl Ernst writes about the manners in which the author, himself a well-regarded calligrapher, lays out the rules for beautiful penmanship, starting with cleansing the self and continuing on to gaining mastery through copying and learning one's craft. Yet the ultimate goal is purity of the soul, which allows the calligraphy to move beyond copying to creativity. And Karl Ernst translates this idea, this goal, as spontaneity, if you will, and which he calls imaginative practice. If we consider the idea of embodiment as the indexical aspect of the calligrapher's practice, it's further emphasized by the aspect of bémars, which is something that Ernst also talks about, literally without the mind, or what Ernst calls the non-reflective, and what I would say is also the intuitive. And I believe that Riza Abbasi is using the term mashq in his drawings in similar ways. and that he is highly cognizant, and in fact, I would say in conversation with its meaning and its significance in the calligraphic context. And I suspect other artists, especially those who masterfully using the technique of siyah and neem qalam, are doing this too. So to sensual and spontaneous, so from between Roxburgh and Ernst, I would like to submit that we include the spatial, and we don't have enough time to talk about that, but I want us to start thinking about not just that we recreate the spaces where these works were made or consumed, which by the way is extremely important, but what that meant from the perspective of the artist's own prospect. What does that mean for the artist as he is in a space and imagining what it is that he's making? That is to be at once present and transported, anchored by the specificities of time and place. And I'd like to argue that in Reza's practice, it is exactly these specificities of the here and now that come into play. And at this point, I'd also like to distinguish between Reza's paintings, which include narrative illustration as well as single sheet drawing paintings, and what I call his sketches, which are usually tonal in black and colored ink and with limited use of color. They appear gestural and quick, and it is this affect of speed that I'm interested in. What we find is that these are also inscribed, the second mode of inquiry that I'm keen to interrogate with you. The old man and the youth that we saw is not the only drawing that is designated as mashq, and in fact, we see a number of these, especially from his early years, including this one, which is titled A Man Hunting the Wolf, which appears almost like two drawings in the spirit of an exercise of copy and practice. This figure on the left is a mounted hunter and his horse is in full stride. And on the other side, we see these disproportionately large wolves looking directly at the pointed arrow. It's as though two narratives may have collided. For example, the Shahnameh and the Kalila wa Dimna, given that the wolves appear to have such expressive faces, especially the one in front, whose open mouth and eyes suggest often speech as well as fear. The inscription lends another dimension, reading Hua on Friday, the 27th of Shaban on the year 1052. Below the date, we are told that it's a mashq, right here on the left. And indeed, the red underlines around the horse's foot, and here you can see these right here. If you look closely, you can see that there's a certain level of experimentation that this drawing may have undergone. And we're not sure actually if this is Reza's work, but given the style and the handwriting, it would be a good guess. There are several drawings in the catalog put together, as I mentioned, by Sheila Canby, in which this term is used, and they need closer study. Another drawing from Lakma is masterful in its representation of a man with a pitchfork, dated 1044. And a drawing such as this is incredibly well observed and executed. So it's difficult to imagine this as a practice exercise, that it's experimental entirely. But rather, I'd like to suggest that we think of mashq more in the sense of the quickness that is implied, whether in the clouds that are swiftly blowing away on the left top hand corner, to the slight flutter of the feather in the man's cap. You can almost hear these leaves on the right rustling. So this idea of evocation and of speed of movement that I think is really part of this gestural, if you will, embodied evocation. Mashq and this other word, hua, that you see here. So we have mashq at the bottom, but at the top, these are starting with hua, are often left off the interpretation of these images. But I'd like to suggest that they are, in fact, the telltale detail that may help us get at the heart of Reza's oeuvre. If mashq represents the human qualities of embodied practice and spontaneity, the hey and the vow that precedes the inscription points to the divine blessings that the artist invokes. Huwa is used in diverse texts as synecdoches for La ilaha illallah, and we see it always on Shah Abbas's imperial farmans, as well as the Waqf dedication, if you remember, on the Muraqqa. Here, Huwa is at once a talisman, as well as a habit, a way of starting a sentence and a way of marking one's piety. Reza's ability to capture likeness, or the chehra gushai, as mentioned in Qummi, is evident in his portraits of courtiers and workmen that he encountered, such as another drawing from the Freer, a collection that's titled Man with a Spindle, which refers to Hakim Sanai. I'm sort of just looking at my time to make sure. Hakim Shamse, excuse me. And the one on the right, which is of Darwish Qiyas. The bent figure on the right of the Darwish is in motion. You can sort of see him moving across the edge of the page, handing a bouquet of leaves to a figure beyond the picture plane. By contrast, the figure of the physician on the left stands still, the spindle's movement suddenly caught by his hand, the only sign of its movement being the slackness of this thread between his hands right here. The Hakim looks downward, his attention pulled to some inner thought. Reza's drawings have this quality of movement and stillness in which the artist is at once documenting a movement or alluding to the inner life of his subjects. Adding to this are the diaristic entries on the margins of the pages, inserting himself as a witness to a moment in time. And of course, you know, I'm talking about Reza, but I hope in a longer version of this conversation, one would be talking also about Moin Musafir. And I'd like to sort of gesture to Masume Farhad's wonderful essay on the boy being attacked by a tiger that really sort of builds on some of the points that I'm trying to, or has already built on some of the points that I'm trying to allude to here. Which brings, so this idea, this balance, if you will, of reportage and allusion mark Reza's work and are perhaps most keenly seen in these two images. They sort of together, they sort of help us understand. But I want to bring us back, again, as I'm looking at the time, to Mashhad, where we started, and sort of end with some remarks. So we know from the chroniclers that from Firozkoh, the Shah followed his advance party east and turned his attention to the recapture of Mashhad as well as Herat. The primary reason for Shah Abbas's eastern campaign was the capture of Khorasan, and most importantly, that of Mashhad and the holy shrine of Imam Reza. After a hard-earned victory on the 25th of Dhul-Hajj, 1006, which is July 1598, Shah Abbas arrived in Mashhad to perform pilgrimage at the shrine of Imam Reza. According to Munshi, and I'll quote, "When the dome of the shrine came in sight, the Shah dismounted, prostrated himself with his forehead on the ground, and wept tears of joy. He then proceeded barefoot and bareheaded to the shrine. After he had completed the formalities of the pilgrimage, the Shah took stock of the shrine. He found it in bad condition, stripped of its gold and silver chandeliers," unquote. 3 days later, on the 28th, the Shah marched from Mashhad towards Herat, where over the first week of Muharram, a fierce battle would ensue against the Uzbeks. And those of you who might remember, we started with one of those images from Siyahi-Nizam's Futuhat-e-Humayun. The drawing that I turn your attention to, like many that I've discussed today, is part of the Freer collection at the National Museum of Asian Art, and it's from what is known alternately as the Riza Abbasi album or the Sareh album. And before we take a closer look at it, I should note that Friedrich Sareh was also in Ardabil many years after the Russian occupation in 1897. So it's not clear whether this album, and again, my colleagues from the museum are here, so I shouldn't say more. I would love to hear more from you, perhaps when we have a chance. So we're not sure whether this came in his possession in AKPIA or in Berlin. I'm not sure. But back to Reza. This drawing is certainly a sketch done on the spot, not only for the quickness of the brush strokes, but also of the inscription on the side that you see here, which is very hurried, and it's also smudged. And it says, in blessed Mashhad, the last day, Friday, the 10th of Muharram, at the Daulat Khane, in the company or the service, the khidmat of friends, written by Reza in the year 1007, which corresponds to 13th of August, 1598. Specifically, and we see here, Khasusan Sahib Mirza Khawajigi, may God keep him safe. The first thing that the artist has noted is the place, Mashhad. Second, it's a Friday and the 10th of Muharram, which is Ashura, the day when the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad was martyred in Karbala. That the day was spent in the company of friends is no surprise, as it's a day of intense mourning and sadness. And it is the summer of 1598. Just a few weeks earlier, the Safavids had entered the holy city when Shah Abbas fell to his knees in thanks. And as Reza was gathering with his friends to observe Muharram, a bloody battle had just taken place in Herat, where the Safavid army had finally routed the Uzbeks from Khorasan. That was the 9th of August. This drawing was done during the period of war, celebrating victory perhaps, also lamenting the dead. Although Mashhad was regained, the shrine of Imam Reza lay in ruins, stripped and defiled. This figure, which has been catalogued as the pilgrim, and who we may also consider to be the said Mirza, perhaps, captures well that moment. He's removed his turban, perhaps because of the August heat, as he stands looking out at a scene that has caused him some distress. Look at his face. The brows are furrowed, his hand is rubbing his head with uncertainty. He looks outward, but his body turns into itself. The arms are held near. Given Jalaluddin Yazdi's note about the imperial entourage in Firozkoh, in which Shah Abbas was presented the Muraqqa in the presence of his artists, Sadiqi Beg and Ali Reza, we shouldn't be surprised to see Reza on the campaign trail as well. Artists, like historians and astrologers, were there to take note, to document the world around them, to bear witness. And indeed, it was a world that was rapidly changing, with borders solidifying just as objects and people were crossing thousands of miles across the globe. The early modern period was not just one of conflict, but of great uncertainty. The artist, like the writer, was called upon to help make sense of that world, even as he resolved to make sense of his own place within it. So let me end with an image that some of you have heard me speak about before, because I believe this idea of displacement is in many ways at the core of what the early modern subjectivity might be. This drawing, which has been called the scribe, or the bearded man, sits gazing off the margins of the page. His legs are tucked under and his elbow and hand rest on a big pillow. The inscription reads that it was completed on Friday, the 21st of Jumad al-Thani, in the evening of Nowruz, and it's the work of the humble Riza Abbasi. What a square piece of paper and a small ink pot sit in front of him. I'd spoken then of an elderly man contemplating the twilight of his years on the evening of the new year. I'd like to add to it another reading. I recently came across a manuscript at the Laurentian Library in Florence. The book had been brought by the Vecchietti brothers. And you can see their little bookmark, ex libris there. for the Medici Oriental Press, and that's a story in itself. The manuscript is actually two books. The first is the political thought of Al-Farabi, and you can see that title up here. And the second, uncatalogued, is the story of Rustam and Sohrab from the Shahnameh. Both sections end with a colophon with the signature of the Katib or the copyist. For the first section, which is here on the right, we have the signature, which is here on the sort of angles forming the colophon, and it reads roughly that the lowly servant, the faqir, the hakir, in need of the Prophet's blessings, Muhammad al-Husseini. And on the other side, he gives a little couplet that whoever says a prayer, I'm covetous of it, as I am myself a sinner. So in some sense, asking for himself these prayers, or marking perhaps his own mortality and humanity. On the second coda, which is here, we get a little bit more. And it starts here with the Tamam Shud, the Dastane, Sohrab, Rustam. The story of Rustam and Sohrab was completed on Saturday, the 20th of Jumad al-Sani in the year 975 by the lowly servant, the Faqir, in need of the Prophet's blessings, Muhammad al-Husseini al-Isfahani. And so he adds the place, al-Isfahan, and he continues that as I sit here writing my name, I know not what will befall my destiny. Reading this couplet in a book that had traveled across the seas, perhaps from a small kitab khane in Isfahan to a monastery in Florence, that displacement in time and place that Riza captures in so many of his drawings makes all the sense in the world. And I'd like to stop here and thank you for allowing me to have some of these thoughts and ideas about this incredible work.